Welcome, class, to the lecture for Week 2 in ED 5755. This week, we'll be learning about an organization, the National Association for Gifted Children, and we'll be learning about their standards for gifted identification. Today, we're going to be talking about how it matters what construct you're identifying for. In other words, we touched on this last week. You might be identifying the mathematically gifted student, or you might be identifying the creative gifted student. It's important to be very clear and understand what are we identifying for. We're going to talk for just a brief minute about the National Association for Gifted Children, or NAGC, and we're going to look at one of their standards to guide the process of identification. First, let's have a little fun. Let's take a gifted ed quiz and see how many of these gifted people you can identify. This scientist was only a mediocre pupil in undergraduate studies and ranked 15 out of 22 students in chemistry. Can you think about who this might be? It might surprise you to learn that this student was Louis Pasteur, who later went on to become famous for his groundbreaking work in pasteurization and sterilization in the medical industry. Walt Disney would not hire this famous cartoonist. Who might this be? Charles Schulz. You might know him as the creator of the cartoon Peanuts. This aspiring actress was told by the head instructor of the John Murray Anderson Drama School, try any other profession. Who might this be? You might have guessed it was Lucille Ball. This music student was told he was hopeless as a composer. He went on to write and become one of the most astoundingly prolific and recognized composers in the world, Beethoven. This famous writer only had 7 poems published in her lifetime. But what poems they were, this was Emily Dickinson. This famous entrepreneur's store failed 7 times before it caught on in New York City. If you've ever shopped at Macy's, you might recognize this one. R.H. Macy founded that store. The first time this famous comedian walked out onto the stage, according to him, he forgot the English language and was actually jeered off stage. He later went on to have a famous television show, Jerry Seinfeld. The director of the Blue Book modeling agency told this hopeful model, "You'll better learn secretarial work or else get married." And he said that to Norma Jean Baker, otherwise known as Marilyn Monroe. This scientist dropped out of his medical career and went on to fame in science. The father of evolution, Charles Darwin. And finally, this individual was booed from the podium when he presented his scientific research. Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist. I do these little quizzes to help you realize that it's not always easy to know or spot gifted talent. And so when we are thinking about who is gifted in our classroom and who is not, we need to keep this in mind. Last week, we explored the golden rule of identification. We talked about there needed to be a consistency between how we define giftedness, how we identify those students, and how we program or serve those students. So again, if we're going to identify for talent in the creative arts, we have to have a way to do that. We have to define it as that. We have to have tools to do that, assessments, and we have to provide programming for creatively and artistically talented students. So today, let's focus in on what construct are we identifying. You might recognize this from last week's lecture. This is the federal identification for gifted and talented students. Again, that has no teeth. but many states do use it as a guideline to form their own definition. That being said, in 2017, some researchers, Callahan, Moon, and O, did a survey of gifted programs across the country. And they said, what do you identify for? And of the respondents, 99.5% of districts said that they identify for intellectual aptitude. So think about IQ, for example. 55.9% said they identify creative or divergent thinking. So it doesn't mean that it's either or. It means that in some way, shape, or form, they were using tools or assessments to identify for these characteristics. It could be intellectual aptitude and creativity. 44.9% said they identify for visually and performing arts gifted. So students who might be good singers or dramatically inclined. Some 41.6 used a specific academic aptitude. So that would be, for example, your mathematically talented students or you're talented in science or reading. 35.9% identified for leadership skills. And 28.8% said they identify with academically gifted with high performance across domains. So you can see that a large majority of districts do take intellectual aptitude into account, whether or not they identify in other areas. Let's digress for a moment and talk about the National Association for Gifted Children, or NAGC. You might hear it called. This is a professional organization. If you continue in the field, you may wish to join. It has things for teachers, for parents, for researchers, for faculty members such as myself. And what you're seeing now is a shot of the home screen. There are links in this week's modules to take you to various parts of the NAGC website. But if you just want to go to the home screen, you can get there with www.nagc.org and you can have a look around. The reason that we're looking at NAGC this week is that they have published a set of standards that identify best practices in gifted education. Standard 2 has to do with identification, which is the subject of this course. Other standards have to do with programming and other things, but we're going to focus on Standard 2, assessment, or what we call identification. So assessment is identification because we're trying to assess students to determine whether or not they meet our gifted criteria. The standards are organized by number. So the first outcome in Standard 2 is called Outcome 2.1, Identification. And it reads, all students in grades pre-K to 12 have equal access to a comprehensive assessment system that allows them to demonstrate diverse characteristics and behaviors that are associated with giftedness. So what that means is that students have to be able to show that they're gifted. If they are not able to show that because the material is not challenging enough or maybe it's too challenging, then they're not going to be able to show that. An important phrase here as well is equal access. So that means every student in the school has an equal chance to be identified. Now, associated with each of these standards is what are called evidence-based practices. So what would that look like in practice? So remember, this was 2.1. So 2.1.1 is an evidence-based practice that states educators develop environments and instructional activities that prepare and encourage students from diverse backgrounds to express characteristics and behaviors that are associated with giftedness. So this gets at the idea that all students should be challenged to show what they're capable of. If they're not challenged, You might not ever spot their potential. And diverse backgrounds is important. So you can't just challenge the students who speak English in your room, or you can't just challenge only the boys. You can't just challenge the students who only come from private schools. You've got to challenge all students and give them an equal opportunity to express giftedness. 2.1.2, aligned with that same standard, is that educators provide parents and guardians with information in their preferred language for communication regarding behaviors and characteristics that are associated with giftedness, and with information that explains the nature and purpose of gifted programming options. So what this means is schools have to provide parents with information written in a language they can understand about what constitutes gifted at their school and what programs and services are available. This has to be provided to all parents, not just potentially gifted students, because they have to be able to understand it and advocate for their child if they think their child might be gifted. 2.1.3 says educators use universal screening and multiple indicators of potential and achievement. So what that means is universal screening, we're going to talk about a little later in the course. You don't just screen some kids for giftedness, because you might miss kids if you're relying on your own judgment for this. Instead, you try to give at least one or two universal screening assessments that are given to all students. It might be, for example, the state test that you're looking at. You might be looking for students who score in the top 10% of the state test, and every student takes that. That's what we mean by universal screening. Multiple indicators mean you don't just rely on one test or one assessment for entry into a gifted program. Most programs have some 3 or 4. It might be an IQ test, it might be an achievement test, it might be report card grades, but there are multiple indicators of potential and achievement. We're going to talk about the difference between potential and achievement, by the way, a little bit later in the course. So that was 2.1. Outcome 2.2 in identification is that students with gifts and talents are identified for services that match their interest rates and needs. So this gets at that whole alignment issue that we were talking about, the golden rule. So you don't identify for something that you can't serve. You don't have a definition that doesn't match your identification process. So what does that look like in terms of evidence-based practices? 2.2.1 focuses on the ongoing policies and procedures. So you have to have a really well-defined set of policies and procedures that include how do you refer students? How do you get informed consent from the parents? How do you assess students? How do you review that information? How do you retain students in the gifted program? Is there ever a need to reassess students? How do you exit a student from the program if it's not working out for them? And is there an appeals procedure for parents and students for both entry, for example, if they're denied entry or if they have to be exited? 2.2.2 evidence-based practice has to do with educators selecting and using appropriate assessments. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about tests and the types of assessments that are used to identify gifted students. But these, for now, understand, these need to be based on the fact that they appropriately identified students' abilities, interests, strengths, and that they're all based on current and reliable research. 2.2.3 says that these assessments must provide both qualitative and quantitative information from a variety of sources. So what does that mean? So quantitative assessments provide a number. So you might give an IQ test and get a number on the IQ. It might be 130, for example. Qualitative information is not numerical, but provides a broader view of the student in general. So, for example, you might have a parent nomination form that asks the parent to write about their child and say why they think they should be screened for the gifted program. And the parent's going to write several paragraphs. That type of information is qualitative and it helps fill out the numerical or quantitative information. 2.2.4 says educators use assessments that provide information related to above grade level performance. So when we talk about assessments, we're going to talk about test ceilings. And this is the idea that some tests have a ceiling too low, and it's so low that gifted students can't really break through that ceiling and show what they're capable of. There's a famous program run by Johns Hopkins that allows students in the 7th grade to take the SAT. Well, you might say, well, why would students in the 7th grade want to take the SAT? It's not for the purposes of entering college like it would be in your junior or senior year. It's meant for the purposes of allowing that assessment, the SAT, to identify gifted students because it has a very high test ceiling. 7th graders wouldn't normally be expected to know the kinds of things that are on the SAT. So if you get a child who's able to get a high score on the SAT in 7th grade, that tool can be used because it has a high ceiling for identification of talent. 2.2.5 says that educators must select assessments that minimize bias. So what does this mean? Some assessments have inherent bias built into them. I'll give you an example. When I was a teacher, I was giving a screening test called the KBIT, the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test. It's a quick and easy test that takes about 15 minutes. It's done individually with students, and it helps you screen students who might have a high IQ. But I noticed that one of the test questions on the KBIT was that children had to look at a picture of a wall outlet and identify that that was an outlet, and they actually had to use that term outlet. Well, students coming from certain areas or from rural areas might identify that as a plug because that's what it's known. So that item might have been discriminatory against students from rural areas. So you want to make sure that the assessments you use avoid bias. 2.2.6 says that educators should use dynamic assessment. As you're teaching in the class, you're going to be collecting information about those students. If you see that a student is able to do easy work, you're going to hopefully adjust the curriculum and give that student more and more challenging work until you reach a point where it's a little difficult for the child to go on. And you know about at that point, you've reached an appropriate level of dynamic assessment. Well, all of that assessment information can be brought to bear when you're identifying students for a gifted program. For example, when I taught in my classroom, I had 4 levels of math at one point. I had 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade. And so by pushing those levels up for the students who were capable of it, we could see clearly who should be identified as mathematically talented. 2.2.8 says that educators must inform all parents and guardians about the identification process. This is a really important standard. You can't assess students usually with assessments that they wouldn't normally do in the classroom. You can't do it outside the classroom without first obtaining parental or guardian permission. Now, it's a little tricky, and you have to check with your district, or your district will inform you, I'm sure, what their procedure is. Assessments that are normally given in class, such as the tests that you normally give in class, those are perfectly appropriate to include without parental consent in an assessment environment that identifies for gifted students. But once you take the step of formally identifying or screening students for the gifted program, there are likely going to be assessments that don't occur in the classroom. So it might be the KBET, for example, that I was mentioning before, or a full-blown IQ test. And so you have to inform parents and request their permission to administer these assessments and for their child to enter that screening process. Another standard that has to do with assessment is 2.3, identification. This standard reads that students with identified gifts and talents represent diverse backgrounds. The first evidence-based practice under that is that educators will select and use equitable approaches and assessments that minimize bias for referring and identifying gifted students. So there are a lot of practices besides the one that we just talked about, which is using instruments and assessments that are not biased. There are other things. You can look at the list at the end. We'll be covering some of these in class. One of the ones that we'll be talking about is using locally developed norms. So what that means, for example, is instead of using cutoffs and saying, okay, a child has to be at a 130 IQ and they have to score in a certain score on a standardized test, many districts will use locally developed norms. So what they'll say is, okay, a student has to be in the top 10% of a standardized test. And they look at the scores in a range of the school, and they say top 10%, and that will qualify these students. The reason for that is that many school districts, particularly school districts that are not in affluent areas, that are in poorer areas, that haven't had the resources to develop their students' test scores, they can't compete. If a district has one set of scores, this happened in the district where I used to teach. One area of the district was affluent, one area of the district consisted of migrant farm workers' children, and they used the same standards for both of those areas. And they'd say, okay, the cutoff on this to get into the district program is X. Well, obviously, if you're in an affluent area and you've had more opportunities, as a student, you're going to be more likely to achieve X than if you've been in a migrant farm community moving around, working on crops, for example. And so local norms addresses that need so that children in the migrant school would need to score in, for example, the top 10% to get into the gifted program. The next evidence-based practice is that educators understand and implement district, state, and our national policies to foster equity in gifted programs and services. So some of these national policies are the standards, for example, we're going over right now. You have to be aware of what's going on in your district, in your state, and even at the national level to make sure that your local school is fostering those particularly and in alignment with those policies. So what have we learned about identification here? We've learned that it's important to understand the definition of gifted used in the district and understand what construct that is identifying. Does the definition match programs and services in the district? Is the process fair and accessible to all students? Does the process use multiple measures that are current and well-researched? Does the process identify underrepresented students? And is the process communicated well to all students and parents? Everybody have a great week, and I'll talk to you next time.